Yay! Ashley is going to lead us in prayer, and then Julie is going to talk about the soup that she made, and we'll get some soup. Michael will introduce our speaker, and then we'll hand it over to our wonderful guest. Great. Thanks for being here.
So I invite everyone just to take a few moments to take some deep breaths in or out in this space. I'll read our opening prayer. Almighty God, help me remember that you alone are perfect. You alone possess infinite patience. When I expect perfection from myself, teach me humility. When I seek perfection in others, give me patience. Help me treat others as I would. Have them treat me, knowing that we are all imperfect. Rid my mind of pride and power, this day and always. Amen.
Amen.
Soup time.
Wonderful, folks. Thanks for joining us. So our soup is a roasted garlic vegetable soup, potatoes and carrots, and there's a list of ingredients if anybody needs to check for tomorrow.
Ready?
All right, we're going to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Johnny Zokovitch. He is the executive director of Pax Christi USA.
Correct.
All right. I said this before. I've known Johnny since we were both in college. He was ran a Catholic worker in Gainesville and has done a lot of peace and justice stuff throughout the course of his life. And he is going to speak to us today about the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. So take it away, Johnny Zokovitch.
Great. Is it okay if we did quick introductions? Just
Totally.
who all's in the room? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Maybe we just start on your side, Mike.
I'm Michael Schreiner. I'm a campus minister here at St. Louis University.
Great.
I'm Brittany Pensnow. This is actually my first time being at one of the officials.
Great. Nice to meet you, Brittany.
I'm Rhett Slayball.
Sounds good.
What year are you at? So what are you all studying?
Senior, and I study forensics and bio.
I'm a senior and I'm studying data science.
I'm Maddie. I'm a senior studying social work.
I am Becca, a campus minister at SLU.
I'm Shannon. I'm a junior and I'm in nursing. I'm Catherine. I'm a junior and I'm also in nursing. I'm Anna Grace. I'm a junior and I'm in marketing.
My name is Ashley. I'm a master's of public health student, and I'm a campus ministry graduate intern. I'm the office coordinator here at campus ministry.
I'm Bridget. I'm a sophomore and I'm studying international studies French.
I'm Molly. I'm a senior and I'm studying public health.
I'm Carmen. I'm a senior studying international studies and political science.
All right. Great. Well, it's nice to be with y'all today. As Mike mentioned, I'm with an organization called Pax Christi USA. It's the National Catholic Peace and Justice Movement, and we've been around since 1972 here in the United States, although we're part of an international network that has 120 member organizations in 60 countries around the world, all working on different issues around peace, justice, reconciliation, that kind of thing, wherever they're located at, from the DR Congo to Brazil to the Philippines and all around the world. So it's really good to be with y'all today. What I'm going to talk about today is a project of Pax Christi International that a lot of the different sections, member organizations around the world participate in, which is called the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. And this initiative started in 2016, and it really started at the initiative of Pope Francis in many ways. That when Pope Francis, I guess we're celebrating 10 years of Pope Francis now this year, I think. Mm-hmm. When Pope Francis, became Pope and was deciding on what his name would be, and he chose Francis, one of the things that he held up was the sort of charisms that are associated with Saint Francis and with the Franciscan, a Franciscan understanding of theology, of spirituality. And one of the hallmarks of that theology, that spirituality, that practice is nonviolence. So Pope Francis has made nonviolence one of the themes of his papacy. And in 2016, a group of Catholics from around the world gathered at the invitation of the Vatican. It was a combined conference between the Vatican's, it was at the time it was called the something of Justice and Peace, not like Department of Justice and Peace. Now it's called the Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development. But that was before there was a reshuffling at the Vatican and stuff. So it was the Vatican and Pax Christi International that held this conference in Rome that was focused on nonviolence. And what it did was it brought practitioners of nonviolence from around the world together. So people not who just had a sort of theoretical understanding of nonviolence, but were actually putting nonviolence into practice in the communities that they were a part of. Sisters from Iraq, Jesuit priest Francisco de Rue from Colombia, folks that had been in South America in places like Honduras and El Salvador, the Philippines, places like the DR Congo and Burundi and Rwanda. They brought these practitioners together for the purpose, really, I think, I don't know if this was named prior to the conference itself, but it became sort of the calling card of the conference itself, was to affirm the centrality of nonviolence within the Catholic social justice tradition. That if we look over the long history of Catholicism, there's different tacks that the church has taken in looking at things like war and conflict. But what we see is that there's a thread that goes back to Jesus and really goes before Jesus to the prophets themselves and extends through saints like Saint Francis and up to people like Oscar Romero and Dorothy Day and other Catholics of more modern times, that an outlook, like a disposition towards war and conflict from a Catholic perspective needs to be rooted in the practice and the understanding and the preaching of Jesus. And what Jesus showed over and over again was his approach to conflict was through nonviolence. Now, the church has had different ways of talking about war and conflict over the centuries, including the most popular thing that probably people have heard about is like the just war theory. And the just war theory, in some ways, started with Augustine and being developed by St. Thomas Aquinas and other folks like that, became the sort of theological practice de rigueur of the church in terms of looking at war and conflict. And what this conference in 2016 did was it wanted to go back to the roots of our faith. It wanted to go back to the practice of Jesus. It wanted to look at what is a compatible practice a practice that's compatible with the preaching and the practice of Jesus. And what it came away with was this understanding that nonviolence really is part and parcel of our tradition, and that it should be the central organizing principle in our practice as Catholics, as people of faith in the world, because it's attached to and it's rooted in the practice and the theology and the preaching of Jesus. So what this conference set out to do was to share the experience of people who had been in situations of conflict and to hold those up as sort of models or prisms for understanding how it is that nonviolence jives not only with our values, but also that it has an effectiveness that extends well beyond what typical practices of armed resistance, military might, military solutions to conflict do. That what we've seen over and over again in studies of conflict is that when conflict is solved through military means, when conflict is solved through the practice of violence, when it's solved through the force of arms, is that the peace that's bought from that is sort of an enforced peace. It's not a peace that is truly organic. It's not a peace that is integral, a peace that is sustainable. It's not a just peace. But what nonviolence does, and when we've seen this in different ways around the world, when we've seen nonviolence be the operative principle in revolutions around the world or in social change in different places, is we've seen that it, in and of itself, has the roots of a just peace in it. That it is twice as likely as violent solutions to engender peace for the long haul, sustainable, just peace within countries or between peoples. And one of the prime examples of this, and we had this person who spoke at the conference in Rome that was associated with it, was the People Power Revolution in the Philippines. Is anybody familiar with the People Power Revolution? That's okay. Michael Schreiner, very good. Check. All right. So the People Power Revolution happened in the 1980s. And for a long time, the Philippines were under the dictatorship of a person named Ferdinand Marcos. And what happened is that there was a revolution in 1986. And it was a largely nonviolent, bloodless revolution that threw out Marcus, that brought to power a champion of the people, Corazon Aquino. And it was a revolution that had been 2 generations in the making and was spurred on specifically by the Catholic Church. Because what the Catholic Church in the Philippines had been doing for 2 generations is educating and training their people in the practice of nonviolence. It was something that if you were a Filipino kid, in your teens or in, 10 years old or whatever, you learned nonviolence right along with sacramental preparation, right along with Sunday school, right along with whatever preparation you had within the church. That it was considered part of your faith, that nonviolence was as integral and as central as the practice of prayer, the practice of the sacraments, the practice of the Eucharist. That nonviolence was a part of Catholic identity within the Philippines. And what churches have been doing for 2 generations is training their people, training young people, training their parents in both nonviolence as a lifestyle, but also nonviolent tactics. So that when the moment came and the Marcos regime was vulnerable, there were 2 generations of people that had been steeped in the practice and the tactics of nonviolence. And they were able to take a situation that very easily could have turned violent, and they were able to put nonviolent direct action into effect to be able to take down a dictatorship and to install a new regime in the Philippines. And this was sort of a study for folks within the Catholic Church about what would be the power, what kind of power could the Catholic Church exert if all 1 billion Catholics in the world took nonviolence as seriously as they take their attendances at Mass, take as seriously as the practice of the sacraments. And so this was part of what the understanding of this conference was about. It was about trying to reaffirm the centrality of gospel nonviolence at the heart of the Catholic Church in terms of practice and in terms of proclamation. So this conference in Rome gathered together people from around the world to share these stories and to really start a dialogue within the larger church. And since that, and what was born from that conference in 2016 was the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. And what Pax Christi has been doing in tandem with the Vatican and in tandem with other organizations within the Catholic Church is educating people within the Catholic Church around nonviolence, around its efficacy, around its practice, and around its roots within the heart of Catholic identity. So that's what the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has been about over these last now since 2016. So it's been about 6 or 7 years of practice now. And we've had folks speaking at colleges, we've had folks speaking to conferences, we've had people speaking to dioceses, to parishes all around the United States, but really all around the world, trying to return the Catholic Church to this fundamental practice of nonviolence at the heart of its mission. And I think especially right now, with what we see happening in Ukraine, for instance, there has been a sort of a groundswell of interest in what does the resolution of conflict look like if it's not resolved through violence, if it's not resolved through military means. And so what it has opened up within our own church is sort of a burgeoning conversation about the practicality of nonviolence, about the limits or the promise of nonviolence, as well as the actual application of nonviolence in different situations. And one of the things that the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has been talking about is that a big criticism is that in situations of great violence like war, that nonviolence is not effective, that nonviolence doesn't have the tools to be able to address sort of full-scale, large conflict. And what the response has been is that it's really never been tried, or it's never been invested in the way that we've invested in solutions that come on the military side of things. So when you look at nonviolence and you ask, well, how would nonviolence work in this situation or that? One of the premises that we start with is that the work of nonviolence, whether it's within the church or whether it's in society at large, begins with an investment into nonviolence. That if we want to be able to have effective nonviolent strategies and solutions, that we need to start investing in them now, not in the moment when violence or conflicts arises, but rather that it's a long process that needs a long runway to be built up to be able to respond to the needs of the time when there is conflict, when there is violence in the world. So the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative has taken on this as a major focus of its work, is to try to shift the Catholic understanding away from what would be a sort of a just war tradition, a tradition that justifies war or conflict under certain conditions, which Pope Francis has said unequivocally that in the modern world, the just war tradition no longer holds up, that there is not justification in the way that there might once have been. And this is akin to what the Pope, starting with John Paul and going with Pope Francis as well, teaches about the death penalty. That there might have been a time when the application of the death penalty was necessary because it met certain conditions that were necessary for the safety or the security of people in society. But the evolution of Catholic social teaching holds that in the modern world, there is no reason for the death penalty, that there is no justification for it. In the same way, we're seeing an evolution in the just war tradition towards nonviolence as being the operative principle in terms of Catholic social teaching, looking at situations of war and conflict in the world. So there's just a really, I think, rich conversation happening around nonviolence right now, spurred on by the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative within the church. And what it's really most deeply rooted in is our understanding of the gospel. That when we, and I think it might have even been a priest here at SLU, a scripture scholar whose name is escaping me, but tell me if it comes to you, is who said, if Jesus taught us anything, he did not teach us how to kill. He taught us how to die. Like that's what Jesus taught us. Jesus taught a redemptive path away from violence that includes the acceptance of suffering, the acceptance of redemptive acts that transform or put an end to the cycle of violence rather than perpetuating the cycle of violence. And that should be at the heart of our Catholic tradition. And it was at the heart of our Catholic tradition in the early church. When one of the hallmarks of being a Christian, in the first several centuries after Jesus's death, was that you didn't participate in the military, that you didn't participate in the war, because to fight and to kill on behalf of a nation or a state or for whatever reason was antithetical to the gospel message of Jesus. And it was only as the church capitulated to the culture in which it was a part of that these radical messages of Jesus, like this message of nonviolence, became a sort of undercurrent, subversive to the dominant current within the church, which found justification for violence in certain limited contexts. So that's the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. Since that conversation, or since that original conference in 2016, they had a follow-up conference in 2019 that I participated in in Rome as well, that sort of broke open this a little bit more, invited more people into the dialogue at the top levels of the church. We've seen some of the cardinals here in the United States, like Cardinal Tobin in New Jersey, Cardinal McElroy out in San Diego, pick up the themes of nonviolence and start to challenge the church. We've seen it as a topic of what's the word I'm looking for? Like intelligent dialogue within Catholic circles, initiated in dioceses like the Diocese of Chicago, which is approaching gun violence through nonviolent nonviolent intervention, nonviolent disruption, and we're just seeing it was sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Just a filtering up of this idea that what we have done in the past to try to answer situations of war and conflict has not worked for us in the long haul, and we ought to be exploring different things and investing in different tools. If every one of the common colloquialisms around war and conflict is that, part of the reason that we continue to invest in, and we continue to have war and conflict, is because we continue to prepare for war and conflict. That if all of your tools, if your only tool is military might, then everything looks like it needs a military solution, and that we need to be exploring and looking at other means. And for Catholics in particular, who find their discipleship in Jesus, that nonviolence is something that we need to start taking seriously, and we need to start being able to create the atmosphere, the environment where nonviolence is not an add-on to the practice of our faith, but is at the very heart or central to who we are or who we identify as disciples of Jesus. So I don't want to go too long here. I know it's a little bit after 12:30, and I know folks have got to get off to classes and whatnot in a little bit, but I was hoping that we might just have a little dialogue, or if there are questions or comments, and feel very free to dispute what I say here, or to argue, or to ask difficult questions, because I am one of those people who believe in the power and the promise of nonviolence. I also don't think that nonviolence is a simple thing that is just a matter of saying, oh, now I'm nonviolent and let's be nonviolent together and stuff like that, but rather that there are serious questions that need to be raised if we're going to put nonviolence at the heart of our practice as Catholic Christians in the world. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, Ashley.
Yes. I don't want to jump ahead to another day's theme.
Sure.
But I just think like a lot about dialogue, and Pope Francis and Fratelli Tutti talking about fraternity and whatnot. It just seems to me that, like, are people ready for that? Like, are people ready for nonviolence? And I've had long discussions, and had a long discussion in a class I took last year about dialogue, and it just feels like I'm just wondering, I guess, like how this works in practice, and I guess how Pax Christi is doing this in different countries, because every country is going to have a different context, and I just feel like in like an ideal world, like yes, people would commit to nonviolence, like that's the norm. Dialogue is the norm.
Right.
We can have folks around the table and dialogue. But I just, maybe this is my pessimistic side, it's just not happening.
Yeah.
And at least like in Fratelli Tutti, I feel like it feels very lofty and unrealistic, and people aren't ready to sit down at the table together. So I guess like what does this commitment entail, and like what is Pax Christi doing? Like actually, I don't want to say actually doing, but what are like the activities, I guess, that are involved in this work to like commit to that norm, and it not just be like a lofty, oh, like we're committing to this.
Yeah,
that's very convoluted. I just don't feel like people are ready. Like if you were to sit like certain people down at a table, no, it's not.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. There's a couple different starting points. One, I want to talk about economy, first of all, because there's a whole economy around violence as well. That there's the way that we're set up economically almost invites, the manufacturing of war and conflict, because, somebody once said to me, if the United States, if our biggest export was shoes, then we would make sure that the rest of the world was barefoot and they needed to buy our shoes. By the same token, our number one export as the United States is weapons. And those weapons have to be used. Otherwise, they're not profitable. So there's an economic underpinning to war and conflict that we never talk about. That sort of is a starting point, I think, for talking a little bit about that. So part of it is, again, this might sound really small, but one of the activities that we're most involved with, and this is a perfect day for it because President Biden just released his budget, the federal budget for 2024. And the federal budget for 2024, I think it's asking for $840 billion for the military. And one of the programs that we're part of is something, it's a campaign called Bread Not Stones. From that biblical passage about, who among you would give your child a stone when they ask for bread. And the premise is that we keep investing in stones and we're not investing in bread. And so we have a very, very small ask in this major national campaign. And our Bread Not Stones part of it is just sort of the, like one small, nook and cranny of a much larger movement around this. But the big ask, which is really a small ask, is let's just take 10% of the Pentagon budget and put it towards solving those needs of people that underline conflict, like poverty, like racial injustice, like climate change. Let's just take a small portion of that, because the overwhelming, number one line item in the federal budget for the United States is military. And it is such that it is equivalent to, I think, and I'm not going to get this exactly right, so don't quote me on the exact number, but if you look it up, it'll be somewhere similar to this. Like, our budget is equivalent to like the next 17 largest military budgets combined around the world. So we have got 17 times more than the next 17 largest military budgets. So the idea is that we keep investing in war and conflict, we're going to keep having war and conflict. And if we don't start looking at the root causes to conflict and addressing those, then we end up having them. And one good situation for, like, one good case study of this is Ukraine. And the US media right now is doing a really poor job, I think, of educating us about the long history of what has happened in Ukraine. And again, and this is not in any way to absolve Vladimir Putin or Russian for what is a totally unjust invasion of the country of Ukraine. But it didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened within a context that was set after World War II, which was an East-West conflict with NATO on one side and Russia and the countries of the Iron Curtain on the other side. And what maintained peace between these two major international oppositional forces was the threat of nuclear annihilation and the threat of military intervention. And then when Russia fell in the 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and like 91, 92, when Yeltsin came to power and the Soviet Republic broke up and stuff, there was a moment there when this Cold War understanding of maintaining the peace through sort of mutual annihilation could have been overcome. NATO could have been disbanded. Economic solutions like the EU was like a step in the right direction, because what it did was it bound all those countries that used to be tied to Russia into a network that was economically integrated, so that the benefit of one country was tied to the benefit of the other country. And so there wasn't a push to invade another European country because you were tied together with each other. You had the same interests. But what the maintenance of NATO did was it set up, it continued to operate out of this sense of peace through the threat of military intervention. And that hasn't been talked about. That's not, again, I'm not saying that is the reason for what has happened in Ukraine with Russia. Very well, Vladimir Putin could have decided to do this invasion without that being without that being part of the context as well. But it certainly is in the mix as we understand it, and that we had 30 years to talk about a different way of relating between Western Europe and Russia, between NATO and Russia, countries tied to NATO and Russia, that we just didn't explore. Instead, what we did was we expanded bases. We put more and more bases, along military bases, further, closer and closer to the line of Russian sovereignty. So there wasn't an investment 30 years ago that could have tied Russia more deeply economically, with Europe, that could have tied the interest of those countries together. Again, when we talk about nonviolence, we're not just talking about like nonviolent direct action, like chaining yourself to a tree, so nobody saws it down, or stepping in front of a tank like in Tiananmen Square and putting a flower in the thing. We're talking about things like diplomacy. We're talking about things like the vast majority of the way that we operate in the world as human beings is nonviolent. Like the practice of nonviolence are stoplights. Stoplights are the practice of nonviolence because they curb the danger to all people that are traveling in cars along a road. So when we and it's really hard to say in St. Louis right now because everybody runs stoplights, but in general, but that's like a practice, that's a tactic of nonviolence, is that we all sort of tacitly agree to these rules that keep us from hurting one another. And so in many ways, and we see that in our families too. I mean, by and large, most of our arguments with our families or our friends are handled nonviolently, right? It's rare. Now, there are situations, I'm thinking even in my own family, when it comes to fisticuffs, or when things get out of hand. But by and large, we as human beings, our predisposition is to solve things nonviolently. We have to be goaded into violence. So, as far as the practicality of nonviolence, one of the things like the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative talks about right now is that the solution, that what we should be doing now is talking about the solutions to conflicts that are 20 years down the road. That we don't have the toolkits, the toolboxes to be able to immediately bring the threat of conflict to a nonviolent end right this moment, because we have not been investing in nonviolence in the same way that we've been investing in nonviolence since, I don't know, forever, for however long. So again, a small concrete activity for us is like with this, it's called, we're supporters of the People Over the Pentagon Act, which takes 10% of the military budget, invests it into things that address root causes that in some ways, like it's hard to prove a negative, right? But if you address root causes, you preempt conflicts that could take place. And that's the thing, is that situations that use violence are by their nature reactionary, that they've allowed something to get to a situation where it's solved through violence. Whereas what nonviolence does is it's hard to prove the negative, is it undermines the onset of conflict by addressing the things that will result in conflict down the line. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the 10%, well, the military budget, this is a general question about the United States. Does that include just the US military, or does that include foreign aid that the US gives to other countries for their military aid?
Yeah, that also includes some foreign aid that we give. But by and large, most of it goes, the biggest amount of the military budget goes to contractors that are based here in the United States. So it might be that even military aid, for instance, that goes to a place like Israel or something like that, it's going to be US manufactured weapons that get sent to Israel. It's not like the money goes to them to, it's almost like a circle. The money goes to them to purchase military weapons from the United States. So we get the money back, so to speak. And then other, like on a smaller scale, one of the things that we do as Pax Christi is twice a year, we do nonviolence trainings for people. And it's called bystander intervention training. So that if you're in situations like, what we saw happen on January 6th, the insurrection on January 6th, or you're in a situation where there's a possibility of violence erupting, that you're trained in tactics of de-escalation. That you're able to take a situation that could be threatening on a personal level and be able to defuse it or to de-escalate it. So it's that very top level stuff that we're talking about, like with this Bread Not Stones campaign and looking at the military budget, and it's something as personal as individual bystander intervention training that is about de-escalation tactics. And one of the things that some Pax Christi groups around the United States have gotten involved in, and I think in particular in Austin, Texas, where one of our members, Vicky Lott, has been hired as a consultant to the Austin, Texas Police Department, is to help train police departments in de-escalation. That for the most part, there's a culture within again, police departments often function like small militaries. And there is an assumption of conflict entering into a situation that is solved by raising the stakes rather than de-escalating the stakes. That there's a conflict with somebody, the threat of a weapon or harsh language or the intervention of like power will bring it to an end, which we know for the most part it doesn't. Usually it just escalates the situation. And so we've got different groups and different individuals in Pax Christi that are working with groups to talk about not just de-escalation on the personal level of people, ordinary everyday citizens, but things like in police departments or in other situations where there might be conflict.
Question from down on South Campus.
Yes, sir.
How does one begin the journey of nonviolence? So I think it's one thing to talk about like, oh, Ukraine or Palestine, Israel or whatever, but like how does what are the steps that one can take to begin this journey?
Yeah.
In authenticity.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's lots of entry points. I know for me, and I was raised Catholic, I did my master's at Notre Dame in biblical studies. Like my own journey to nonviolence started with it starts with the person of Jesus. And to me, like discipleship to Jesus is something that I take seriously. And so I think when Jesus calls us, and this is a good time in Lent to follow him, that's not meant to like kind of think Jesus is cool or to go to church or whatever, but it's meant to embody how Jesus was within the world. And so to me, like my own journey to nonviolence started with a rigorous examination of who Jesus is, what he said, what he asks of those people who say that they're going to follow him, and if we're going to live with any authenticity, that wrestling with those things that are especially countercultural, which I think in our culture nonviolence is countercultural, that it begins with an examination there. That being said, I think for somebody not coming from a faith perspective or a different faith perspective, almost all the world's major religions in one way or another. I think of like the Dalai Lama. I mean, the Dalai Lama is one of the great perpetrators of nonviolence in the world. So like other traditions have that as well, but also there's lots of organizations that aren't associated with faith that talk about nonviolence. And like, okay, here's a good place to start too. Like if you like, if you're into movies or stuff like that, things like the movie A Force More Powerful. There's a great book called, oh gosh, it's by Erica Chenoweth and I'm forgetting her name, but it's called Why Civil Resistance Works. And it talks about and examines, Force More Powerful talks about different movements throughout history that have changed the world and have done it largely through nonviolence. And it documents like 100 of them. Why Civil Resistance Works looks at, I think it's at the last 30 years or the last 100 years, and documents all the times that nonviolence has worked to change, for social change within the world. And often it's on the back pages of the newspaper, or it's the story in the C block on the news or whatever. It's not as sexy as reporting on war and stuff like that. But I think that those are good places to start as well. So the series A Force More Powerful or the book When Civil Resistance Works, those are good places to start. And then there's just all kinds. And for us, I mean, here in the United States, MLK. I mean, just let's start with the greatest American, right? MLK. I mean, just what the civil rights movement was able to do, and what MLK was able to do with the Poor People's Campaign was to largely use nonviolent tactics to wring out concessions from those in power. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Yes.
I'm gonna recommend a good book.
Sure.
It's called Beyond Apathy, A Theology for Bystanders. And we read this as a staff. The author is Elizabeth Vasco. It's got you talked about bystander intervention. It's got some really great information on it. You're welcome to look at it, but please return it to me when you're done.
And one thing I will say too is sometimes people think of nonviolence, and I think this is a legitimate criticism, is that some people take on nonviolence and really what they are is they're just cowards. Like there is, like Gandhi said, don't give me a coward, give me a soldier who believes in nonviolence, or give me a soldier who believes in violence, and I will make of that person a nonviolent warrior, a soldier who's willing to lay down their lives, who understands the sacrifice that comes from being part of the military. Gandhi said that that person has the kernel of understanding of what it means to be nonviolent. Whereas somebody who chooses nonviolence from a place that they don't want to engage in conflict, or they're afraid of conflict, is that nonviolence isn't something that takes hold there. That's a sheen for something else that's happening. So I think that when we talk about nonviolence, it's not like the absence of conflict, or it's not about trying to avoid or evade conflict, but rather Marie Dennis, who is a longtime member of Pax Christi, and she was the co-president of Pax Christi International. Marie talks about what we need to espouse is like a strong muscular nonviolence. It's a nonviolence that is willing to enter into conflict, that is willing to sort of to stand up to power in such a way, or to engage in disruption in such a way that that comes from a place of strength, so to speak. And I'm not doing justice to what Marie talked about, but there's a difference between, I think it's really important to talk about, and for those of us, I'll end it there. I'll stop right there. Okay. Other questions or comments?
This is more of a comment
Yeah.
than a question, but I was really struck by what you said, that you said something like we need to be pushed into nonviolence, or like you used a different word. But like I think the rhetoric in this country especially is that we will always choose violence,
Yeah.
and we need to be taught nonviolence, but it's actually the opposite.
Yeah.
I just found that really powerful.
Well, and I mean,
Because I have been thinking opposite.
Yeah. Well, I think
Yeah.
a good, like, I mean, one of the cultural conversations that we're having right now is, around mass shootings in schools. And what we hear espoused is the idea that, let's arm teachers. Let's have metal detectors. Like we raise the stakes instead of talking about the root causes, and instead of like dismantling it at the level of root causes. What we want to do is we believe that somehow we'll solve the problem through a greater threat of violence, or a deterrence which is rooted in violence itself as well. And we just know that doesn't work. And we also know, again, this goes to what Ashley was asking about before, to the economy. I mean, that's driven by the gun lobby. That's driven by the NRA. That's driven by manufacturers of gun. And it's like in many ways, it's the color of violence is green, because violence is profitable. And until we detach profit from violence, like we're stuck with solutions that are rooted in violence.
Yeah.
On that happy note.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
No problem. My pleasure. And I think we'll pick this up in some sense too, because we're going to talk about Pope Francis and nonviolence later on, and we're going to talk about Jesus and nonviolence later on.